Hello Krauses, it's Leah. I was just making an absolutely giant pot of bolognese to pressure can. I wanted to take this opportunity to show you how to can using your pressure canner. Just like any canning, we start out by picking a tested recipe. We've got beefy bolognese out of the Ball canning book here. I decided, because I'm me, that I'd like to make 1.5 times as much of a recipe, and so before I started, I did the math on paper as well as reading all the steps in the recipe more than once to make sure that I knew what was happening. Then I got my clean lids, my rings, a ladle, depth gauge, debubbler, canning funnel, and then the pressure canner. This bolognese needs to come up to a simmer before it goes into the jars. It's a hot pack recipe. And so while it's doing that, I was going to show you around the features of the canner. This is a Presto 16 quart canner. You have a 23 quart, so you can actually hold more jars in yours. But as far as putting the lid on, bringing it up to pressure, and using it, the steps are all going to be the same. One of the things to notice on the inside, number one, all canners are made out of aluminum, so as you use them they will discolor and darken in the bottom. It's not a big deal. Food's not coming in contact with that, so don't worry about that at all. You can see on the edge of the canner here there's a couple of marks. There's one, and there's one, and there's one. There's a lower one right there. Those 3 marks, at least in mine, and yours will have 3 marks at least as well, are your fill lines for using it as a pressure canner, using it as a water bath for half-pint jars, and using it as a water bath for pint jars. You may have another mark in yours that you can water bath quart jars. I cannot water bath quart jars in this pressure canner. One other thing you'll notice, there's a little arrow on one of the handles, and on the lid there is a corresponding arrow, and so when we go to put the lid on, we're going to line those up. The other thing, just like in a water bath, is you never want to put the jars directly on the bottom of the pot. You always want to have a rack so that water can freely circulate around the jars and you're not getting the direct heat of the burner on the jars. Few more features of the lid. You have a rubber gasket. You should always look at your gasket for any signs of dry rot or cracks or anything like that that would make you think that you're not going to be able to get a seal to hold pressure inside of the lid. You flip it over. You have a little black rubber circle. That is the overpressure valve. It has some wiggle room to it. When the pot is coming up to pressure, you may see, because of that little bit of wiggle room, you may see it move up a little bit. If for some reason the actual vent pipe ever got clogged and dangerous amounts of pressure were forming inside of the pot, this little rubber plug would blow and the pot would release steam. So the canner itself will never blow up unless you actually work to disable this safety feature. Having said that, if you're troubleshooting your pot at any point that you are wondering why your rocker isn't rocking or something like that, don't put your face right over that plug, because there is a chance that it could come out and that steam could be released. This is your vent pipe. Let's see if we can actually, there I am. You can see through it, and you should always check and see and make sure that there's no occlusions or blockages that would prevent steam from exiting that pipe. And then you have a little pressure lock that, as pressure forms in the pot, this will move up, and when this little lock is in the up position, you physically cannot remove the lid, so you can't accidentally remove the lid when there's still pressure inside the pot. So that's another safety feature. This is also a great way to know when your pressure in your pot has returned to 0 after you've canned. Your pot came with a 1-piece 15-pound weight that can fit over the vent. And when 15 pounds of pressure have accumulated inside of your canner, the weight will start to rock or jiggle, releasing little bits of pressure each time it rocks. That's what people talk about when they talk about the weight rocking or jiggling. Because we live below 1,000 feet altitude, our canning pressure for pressure canning is actually not 15 pounds of pressure, it's 10 pounds of pressure. And the easiest way, there's two ways that you can achieve that. One is to watch your dial. This lid doesn't have a dial on it at all. I never intended to use a dial, so I didn't buy myself a lid with a dial on it. But if you like to use the dial, then for altitudes under 1,000 feet, you would keep your pressure at a minimum of 11 psi throughout the entire canning process on the dial, and use the 15-pound weight on there, which would not move at all, because if you're only at 15, which you would regulate turning your burner up and down, then you're never going to hit 15, so it's never going to rock. The dial can lose calibration over time, and so it's recommended, if you're relying on the dial, that you get the dial checked either at your local extension office. Some hardware stores and plumbers will also check and make sure that the dial is properly calibrated. It's recommended that you get it checked at the beginning of every canning season, so once a year, and then any time that the lid is dropped that it might have become jarred and lost calibration. It's important to realize that if it's lost calibration, you may not be canning at the right pressure, and so if you're not canning at the right pressure, if you're over pressure, that's fine, but if you're under pressure and have underprocessed food, you run the risk of botulism, which none of us want. The alternative to just staring at the dial and wondering if the lid was dropped and if it's calibrated and all of those things is to, instead of using a 15-pound weight, use a 3-piece weight that has multiple rings. And if you remove one of the rings, see there's still two, there's the bottom and then that ring, then it's a 10-pound weight. And so that'll rock at 10. You have that for your canner, and that's what we'll be using today, is the quote-unquote 3-piece weight set to 10 pounds. So the bolognese has come up to temperature, simmer. You don't want to put cold sauce into hot jars into hot water because you risk thermal shock and the jars will break. In the canner right now I have 3 quarts of water, which is the lower line that we already talked about. My heat's on medium, and so the canning books tell you that it should be at about 180 degrees. I don't know, it's pretty warm water. I'm going to show you how to fill a jar. You already know how to fill jars. Once I get all the jars filled, then I'll show you how to put the lid on the canner, venting the canner, putting the weight on, canning, and then getting the jars back out. One thing to remember, obviously I have a ton of bolognese here. There is, right, in water bathing there is no minimum load, so you could water bath 1 jar if you wanted to do 1 jar. For pressure canning, because the laboratory experiments were done with essentially full loads that take longer to come up to pressure and come back down from pressure, you don't want to run essentially a canner with very little in it. So the minimum load for any canner is 2 quart jars or 4 pint jars. Your canner, a Presto 23, on one level will hold 7 quart jars or 9 to 10 pint jars, and then you can add a second rack and do a second layer of pint jars if you're doing pint jars, so that in total you could do like 19 or 20 pint jars all at once. So it's really nice to be able to cook one big meal, divide it up, and then have shelf-stable meals that you can dole out as needed in the future. So, as I said, you know how to fill a jar, but I'll show you a couple of tips just for pressure canning. These are hot, they just came out of the dishwasher. I've got my canning funnel. I'll go ahead and get a couple. So for pressure canning, your headspace is 1 inch as opposed to water bath, which is very often 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch, which for most cases is just under your rim there. Because when you pressure can, if you're canning meats or things like that, they're more likely to have oils in them. Instead of just wiping the rim with a wet washcloth, many people, myself included, wet the paper towel with a little bit of vinegar. Clean your rim, clean flat. The flats do not have to be hot, fingertip tight, so not really much to that. And then this is cool enough that I can handle it with my hands, or you could use the jar lifter, and you place it in the canner with hot water. I'll repeat that process for the next 9 jars, and then I'll show you the rest. Okay. Ready? So I've got 10 pint jars in the canner with 3 quarts of water on medium heat. I don't have any vinegar in the water. I don't have hard water. If you have hard water and you're troubled by the idea of hard water deposits on your jars, you can put a little splash of vinegar in the water. Notice that for pressure canning, you do not want the jars to be submerged. The whole point is that you're going to create a pure steam environment where the pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure. Therefore, the temperature of the steam is going to be 240 degrees as opposed to 212 degrees at atmospheric pressure. So, like I pointed out before, there's an arrow. I'm going to match it up with the other arrow. The lid will fit on. Give it a turn. You have to push down a little bit for the gasket. And the lid is on. I'm going to leave it on medium heat, and I'm going to wait till I see a steady column of steam coming out of the vent pipe. That's all. A steady stream of steam, say that 5 times fast. From the canner. My timer just went off. That stream has been happening for 10 minutes, which is called venting the canner. It's to make sure that you have a pure steam environment inside, because the steam is going to carry the heat most reliably. So without burning yourself, you're going to place the weight over the vent pipe and then wait. My heat is still just on medium low. You can hear I'm at a rolling boil in there. And it's probably going to take me about a half an hour or so for this to come up to pressure. My little pressure valve back in the back, every now and again it'll stick. You don't want to burn yourself or anything like that, but you can give it a tap. See if you can get it to come up and lock the lid. I only do that if it looks like it's letting steam go by. So now the lid is locked on. Again, you do not have to do that step. It usually does it on its own. I'm going to wait for that to start to rock. This guy may move up just a tiny bit. Don't worry about that. And once the canner reaches pressure and the weight starts jiggling, I will show you what that looks like. Ray, I had so much I had to get the second canner out, so the All-American is double stacked as well and is not yet venting. All right, pressure. My rocker is doing a little hula or a little dance there. Always set a timer when your rocker starts. Double check your recipe. This recipe is 1 hour at pressure, so I can set a timer and I can go into another room and I can just listen for the little rocking. If at any point during processing it stops rocking, that means you fell under pressure and you actually have to start the timer all over again. You don't want your heat to be crazy high because it does let out a little bit of steam each time it rocks. And if you're letting out tons of steam and if you're processing things with long processing times, the longest time I know of is fish at 100 minutes. But your canner can technically run dry. And if that happens, number one, your food could be under processed because it wouldn't be under steam pressure anymore. Number two, you can warp the bottom of your canner if you're heating an empty canner. So I'm going to set my 1 hour timer. I may turn my heat down a little bit. I may just let that ride because I'm okay with that amount of rocking. And then in 1 hour, I'll turn the heat off and I'm gonna walk away at that point, probably for another hour, and wait for that little lock to drop, telling me that I'm at 0 pressure. Once that lock drops and I'm at 0 pressure, I'll take the weight off at that time. Then I'm gonna set a timer for another 10 minutes before I take the lid off. Once I take the lid off, I'll wait another 10 minutes before I take the jars out. And all these delays are because rapid changes in temperature and pressure are apt to cause siphoning. So the change in temperature and pressure can make the contents, the liquid contents in the jars, boil rapidly and essentially overflow the jars. And that can lead to seal failures. If you lose over half the jar worth of liquid, then the jar is not considered shelf stable anymore. So I want everything to be smooth transitions. So to come up to pressure, I stayed on, medium low or so. And it took me about 40 minutes to get to this point. I'm gonna set my 1 hour timer. Once that is done, like I said, it'll be another hour before I take the weight off, and then another 20 minutes or so before I have the jars out. So pressure canning can be a long process. Some things have shorter processing times, like broth. Pints of broth is 20 minutes, and so that's something that you may be able to do faster. A lot of people, if they do end up pressure canning a lot of things, do end up getting a second canner. That way you can run both at once and essentially double your yield for your time that you're devoted to being home. But even though it's several hours worth of time, a lot of it is inactive and you can do other things. Right now I'm actually making crackers at the same time, and as soon as those get done, I'm gonna watch TV. It is about 3.5 hours after we started the little safety pressure, whatever, dropped. I took the weight off. I waited 10 minutes. Now going to open the canner. Hold on 1 sec, you just spin it. Spinning. Opposite of putting it on. Now, let some steam peek out. Some steam peek out again. I usually will let the lid sit like that for a couple minutes, just while everything starts calming down inside. And then, after everything's calm, you can remove the lid, not burning yourself with steam. I'll put this down and do 2 hands. So, jars inside. It's pretty common to see like a couple of drops of oil that leaked out of the jars into the water, so don't worry about that. With pressure canning, even more so than water bathing, it's important 24 hours after your jars come out of the canner to take their rings off and give them a bath. That was our first jar sealing, because a lot of times the jars will have some oil and things like that on it, and you don't want that to go rancid during storage. And just grab a jar out. So you can see the jar is still boiling in there. They don't all always have to boil. However, whether it's an urban legend or what, I think it holds true for my jars anyway, that the ones that are actively boiling when they come out of the canner always seal. The ones that you can't see actively boiling may or may not seal. Either way, don't touch them for 12 to 24 hours, and then check for seals after that. Take the rings off, give them a bath. One thing, we time this so that it's been about an hour since I turned off heat. You can leave them in the canner a little bit longer than that, but you don't want to leave them hot for a prolonged period of time, because you can have secondary changes called flat sour occur, and that happens most commonly when you're canning vegetables, but it can happen with meats and beans and things, and it develops off flavors if it doesn't cool appropriately. So I think that is how to use a pressure canner. Take care.